Welcome, you guys. We are going to do our biodiversity number 2 lecture today. So we are going to start into our third domain of eukarya. So we're going to cover protists, which are those weird guys that aren't really plants, fungi, or animals. So they're kind of a group. They're not really a kingdom. And we'll talk a lot about them. Then we're going to get into fungi and plants, and then next time we'll finish up with our big kingdom of animals. So under eukarya, we've got our plants, animals, and fungi, but what about protists, right? So these guys are technically eukarya, but they don't really fit in their own domain, so they are a group. So what are protists, right? They're kind of these weird eukaryotes, and they're really the first eukaryotes to evolve from prokaryotic ancestors. So they're kind of the early eukaryotes. And they can be quite different. So some are unicellular, right? Some are colonial, meaning they live in colonies, and some are multicellular, right? So here are our three examples. We have a unicellular organism in the middle, we have a colony on the left, and then we have multicellular algae. So algae, or algae, however you want to pronounce it, is a protist. So what kind of energy do protists use? Okay, so we talked a little bit about how diverse prokaryotes are in their energy and metabolism use. Well, protists can be autotrophs, meaning they make their own energy, right? So they can use photosynthesis, or they're heterotrophs, meaning they have to consume something else, or they could be both. Okay, so they kind of can use a lot of different energy as well, very similar to our prokaryotic friends, bacteria and archaea. So protists also have a diverse mode of reproduction. So they can undergo various types of reproduction. So asexual reproduction means essentially binary fission, which is what we talked about with prokaryotes when we were talking about different sexual reproduction versus our prokaryotic friends. So asexual reproduction, you're just gonna make a clone of yourself, essentially, right? A genetic copy. They can exchange genetic material. So that's where they're kind of similar to prokaryotes as well, because we were saying that when we look at prokaryotes trying to get their genetic relationships, it can be quite challenging since they can actually exchange genetic material. And they can also undergo sexual reproduction as well, just like our other eukaryotic kingdoms, okay, and groups. So some protists, we said, are animal-like, and some are plant-like, and some are fungi-like. So let's go through some of those examples in those different groups. So these animal-like protists, for example, are protozoans. And they have cilia and flagella, so they can move around. And some examples we have here are paramecium, so that's a single unicellular organism, kind of like an amoeba or something like that. They actually eat things. And trypanosomes is the cause of African sleeping sickness. So these are red blood cells in the image, and those little worm-like structures are the trypanosomes. So I have a cool video on African sleeping sickness caused by the trypanosomes, essentially. So these guys can be somewhat animal-like, okay? So they don't undergo photosynthesis or anything like that. They invade and ingest other things. So they're heterotrophs, and they're quite interesting. So some protists are also fungus-like. So we said some are animal-like, and now some are fungus-like. So these guys are slime molds, and they are very important recyclers, just like fungus. So they ingest decomposing material. And I have a really awesome video on slime molds. Are you smarter than a slime mold? Because it actually proves that slime molds are able to go through mazes, and they can actually work their way through a maze, which is quite impressive when you're considering what it is, right? It's a slime mold. So quite cool, and they are fungus-like, right? So they are decomposers. And then our other group of protists are plant-like, right? So they're going to undergo photosynthesis, so they're photosynthetic, which is what our plants do. So we do have a couple groups of these protists that are very much like plants, and they're all considered algae. So we have our unicellular algae. So a couple examples of that would be diatoms. And so they're found in lakes and oceans, and they're actually made up of silica. So if you've ever used like diatomaceous earth, it's kind of like ash, it looks like. You can use it in the garden and things like that, and that's actually made up of these unicellular organisms called diatoms. And that's a picture of what they look like on the left-hand side. So they're all very pretty. They're very cool diatoms. And then we have another group of unicellular algae called dinoflagellates. Okay, so these are what are causing algal blooms in the ocean. Or a red tide. So some pictures on the right hand side, you can see the red coloring in the waves on the top picture during the day, and what it actually does is it bioluminesces at night, so you can actually see that cool bioluminescence caused by these algal blooms, by these dinoflagellates, which are these unicellular algae, which is kind of cool. Right, so you know, they're not safe to eat some seafood during red tides, and sometimes it's not as safe to swim in them either because they are these little unicellular protists. So, but kind of cool, right? So these are all unicellular protists. So some are also filamentous or colonial. So green algae, these are two examples of the filamentous on the left, which is Spirogyra. So you can see it kind of spirals, or it's filamentous. And then we have Volvox on the right, which is a colonial algae. So it lives in colonies. Okay, and so these are examples of green algae. And they're all photosynthetic, right? So they're green. And then some are multicellular, okay? So they're still photosynthetic, but our giant kelp, our seaweed, is a protist, right? And they're multicellular organisms. So these guys you may think of as plants, right? But they are actually protists, seaweed and kelp. Just some more examples of some different types of seaweed, right? So they're all protists. So you have different colored ones, feather boa kelp, sea lettuce I see all the time in the ocean when you swim, coralline algae. So lots of different types of seaweed out there, but they're all multicellular protists. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about fungi. I love fungi. I think they're very cool. And most people just think of mushrooms when you think of fungi, but there's actually a whole organism that's actually living in the ground when you actually see a mushroom. So we'll talk a little bit about what the mushroom actually is to the fungi, but the majority of fungi are in the ground, so you're not actually appreciating them on the surface. So they can either be uni or multicellular. They're eukaryotic. right? They're heterotrophic, meaning that they have to acquire their nutrients by, and in this case, by absorption. Okay, so they're going to actually absorb their nutrients in the soil. So they actually digest food outside their body. So we have to ingest food and digest it internally, whereas fungi actually secrete digestive enzymes outside and break down the substances, and then they absorb those nutrients that they've broken down from their surroundings or from the soil. So what do they look like, right? So they have these bodies that are considered mycelium. Okay, so they look kind of like these branching finger-like structures, and then they have these slender threads, which are only unicellular, little hyphae that come off the branches. Okay, so the little hyphae are these branching cellular structures that are the ones that are secreting those digestive enzymes. Okay, and so a real example is on the right hand side there of what a mycelium actually looks like and what a fungus looks like. Okay. So fungi can undergo asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. So they can produce what are called spores that they can release out into the environment, which will create another fungus, right? So it's just putting a piece of yourself out there, making a copy, right? So it's asexual reproduction. And then they can undergo sexual reproduction by fusing two hyphae together. Okay, so kind of an interesting way that they can do that, but they can undergo either form of reproduction. So I just have some examples of some major groups of fungi. So you can kind of go through them and see the different types of mushrooms and the different fungi. And again, we'll go through their kind of reproductive cycle and what a mushroom actually is to the fungus itself. But just some different cool looking fungi. And we have some other types of fungi as well. So we have unicellular yeast, right? So yeast is considered a fungi. And truffles. Truffles are also a type of fungi as well. Okay. So these are things that we consume, right? We consume lots of mushrooms and lots of fungi, but there are some poisonous ones out there as well. So what is the life cycle kind of a fungus, right? Or what is a mushroom? So we said that we have the mycelium, kind of this bottom right-hand side, right? So that's kind of the body of the fungus, and they shoot out those little hyphae branches, but then they can also develop these fruiting bodies. And so the mushroom is actually just this fruiting body or spore forming body of the fungus. And so it's going to shoot above the ground and it's going to give off those spores. So it's the asexual reproduction cycle of a fungus. And so then those spores are able to germinate and create another body or a mycelium fungus. Okay, so what we're eating is really just that kind of spore-bearing, fruiting body of a fungus that comes above the ground. But the majority of the actual fungus is the mycelium, which is underneath the ground. So fungi can actually form some very cool relationships with some photosynthetic organisms. So this is kind of an ecological relationship that they've developed. And some examples of this are lichens. So if you've ever seen a lichen, you can see them on trees, on rocks, and they're a composite organism, meaning they're both fungi and either algae or cyanobacteria. So either an algae, which would be a protist, or a cyanobacteria, which is a prokaryote. And essentially there's a mutualistic relationship because the algae or the cyanobacteria can undergo photosynthesis and make energy for the fungus. And then the fungus actually provides shelter, moisture, and nutrients as well for the algae and the cyanobacteria. So essentially they create this little colony for each other and help each other out. So a lichen is really a composite organism of the two different organisms. But I think one of the most ecological importance of fungi is that they are decomposers. So they break down all of our organic materials of the earth, right? So without them, we wouldn't be able to break down molecules and then use those molecules and nutrients by other organisms. So they're really nature's recyclers is what they are. So because they have to break down substances outside their body, right, they're going to break it down outside and then they can absorb those nutrients. But also it goes into the soil and back into the earth for plants as well as animals and things like that. So they are really the true nature's recyclers. So even though the majority of fungi are good, right, and have those ecological importances, we do see some, about 30%, have kind of a negative effect and can either be parasitic or pathogenic. So if I know maybe some of you have experienced ringworm, right? You have those cute batch of kittens, you've played with them, and now you break out with ringworm. And it is actually a fungus infection. Histoplasmosis, right, affects our lungs, right? So that's a fungi, as well as this wheat or oat fungus, which is called an ergot, and essentially we can ingest it or cattle can ingest it, and it causes like hallucinations and delirium. So you can get this infection from this fungus growing on wheat. So kind of crazy. You can look up ergot. It's kind of crazy. Look up the effects of it. So about 30%, so more fungi is actually having negative effect on us than even bacteria, right? Even though we think of bacteria as kind of the bad guys. So even though we said we had some negative effects of fungi, we usually have mostly positive effects, right? So obviously we eat fungus, right? Mushrooms, they're delicious. We use yeast, the unicellular fungus, for fermenting, right? So fermenting for alcoholic beverages as well as bread, right? And we also use it for medicine. So Alexander Fleming in the early 1900s actually discovered penicillin. So penicillin is an antibiotic, but it's produced by penicillium, which is a mold, which is a fungus. And so penicillium is a mold that produces an antibiotic, which prevents bacterial growth. So if you look at the plate down here on the left-hand side, they've plated some bacteria out in kind of a squiggly line there, and then that top circular structure is the mold, is penicillium, and it's producing penicillin, which is creating a circle of preventing that bacterial growth around the penicillium, around the mold. So it's kind of cool that he was able to discover, and penicillin was one of the first antibiotics that was discovered. Which is very cool that it came from a fungus. But of course, it's kind of an interesting idea, right? So fungus kind of versus bacteria, right? So they're going to have these effects against each other to battle for nutrients and things like that. So penicillin is really cool. And so that's, obviously that kind of spearheaded the medicine positive effects from fungus. And I don't know if any of you guys like blue cheese, but I know I don't. My mom loves it. But penicillium is the mold essentially in blue cheese, which is kind of crazy. So that blue disgusting stuff that you see in blue cheese that stinks, but apparently tastes very good to some people, is actually the mold that produces penicillin. So now we're going to get into our plants. So the kingdom of plants, and they are just so cool. But we have some different groups and different types of plants. So, a lot of us are very familiar with flowering plants and maybe trees, but there's a lot of other plants out there as well that we should talk about. So plants are multicellular, and they're also photosynthetic, right? So we talked about that, and they're eukaryotes, right? Our whole section today is on eukaryotes. So they are terrestrial, right? So they do live on land, and they arose from ancient algae, right? So algae is our protist, photosynthetic eukaryote. So these guys eventually made their way onto land. And what happens is they have this an alternation of generation, and it's their reproductive cycle. So I have a picture over here of their reproductive cycle called alternation of generations. And I think that I have a video that's pretty good that helps to explain this alternation of generations. But essentially they go through a haploid stage, right, where they have these gametes, which they call gametophytes, right, just like in us, right, just like we talked about where we're producing our sperm and egg cells, which are haploid, which are gametes, and then they're going to fuse, and then they're going to undergo their zygote or diploid stage, right, and become what's called a sporophyte. Because the sporophyte is then what's going to produce those spores, which are haploid. So they undergo meiosis. So essentially they go through these two stages of life. And so we'll talk about the different plants and their different alternations of generations. And some spend a lot of their time in one stage or the other, but they all are going to be able to undergo this alternation of generations. So let's talk about the different types of plants or the different groups of plants and how we kind of categorize them. And there's a great video by Bosman Science on land plants and how we actually categorize them. So if you look on the right-hand side, I know it's kind of sideways, right? But we have all land plants. And then we essentially first split them up between non-vascular plants and vascular plants. So remember when we were talking about photosynthesis and we said some characteristics of plants, right? And that they are vascular. So they actually have that xylem and phloem through there bringing water and nutrients back and forth between the roots and the leaves. Well, some plants actually don't have that vascular structure, some very early on plants. So we'll talk about those non-vascular group. So that's our non-vascular plants that we'll cover. And then once you get into the seedless plants, vascular plants, you have seedless plants, right? So they're vascular, but they don't have any seeds. Okay, so we talked about kind of their reproductive cycle, and they do not have seeds. So we'll talk about how they reproduce. And then our other vascular group are seeded plants. So the ones that do have seeds, but within the seeded group, we have non-flowering and flowering. So you can kind of continue to break it up even one more stage than our table on the right-hand side into flowering and non-flowering. Okay, so we'll talk about all these groups. And our non-flowering group are those gymnosperms, which are a great example would be a pine tree. And then our angiosperms, which are our flowering plants. Okay, so we'll kind of work our way through all of these groups. And the video, if you want to check it out, is also awesome. So let's talk about our first group of plants. So these are our non-vascular seedless plants. So they're kind of the first, maybe most ancient type of plants, okay? These guys are known as bryophytes. So that's their overarching name, but within the bryophyte category, we have mosses. So I think probably most of us are familiar with moss. And then we have liverworts and hornworts. Okay, so I have some pictures of those down below, but I think most of us are familiar with moss. Okay. Now these guys, because they're non-vascular and they don't have seeds, right? So they're seedless, they actually need water to reproduce, which is why you find these guys, these bryophytes, in very moist and wet environments, right? So they actually have the flagellated sperm, but they have to swim through the water to reach the eggs. So you do have female and male plants, right? And so they're producing their gametes and then they have to come together, but they need that water to bring them together. So let's look at that reproductive cycle. So if we look at the alteration of generations for our bryophytes, our non-vascular seedless plants, we have kind of this dominant leafy generation, and they are actually the gametophytes. Okay, so we have kind of a male plant and a female plant, and that's when they're going to live most of their life in that gametophyte state. Okay. And then they produce a spore. And so the spore is going to actually be the sporophyte. Okay, so the spore is going to be produced by the sporophyte after fertilization. Okay, so then that sporophyte is able to produce those spores, which will be dispersed out into the environment by wind or whatever, and germinate into a new plant. So the spores are the actual new plant, the zygote that's going to be producing the new plant. Okay, whereas when they're in their gametophyte stage, they're just producing their sperm and eggs, and they need that water to carry the sperm from the male plant to the female plant to undergo fertilization and become a sporophyte. Okay, so I know that's a little confusing, but I hope the little table helps to show you the life cycle of a moss, right? So again, we're in the gamete stage, which is our haploid. They have to fertilize to become a sporophyte, which is our diploid stage, to produce those spores, which will then become a new plant. So our second group of plants are vascular. So now they do have a xylem and phloem system where they can bring the water up to the leaves and then the nutrients down from the leaves to the rest of the plant. But these guys are still seedless. So these guys are our ferns and relatives of ferns, but definitely kind of think of ferns. And they have that vascular tissue. Okay, so they can bring up water, so they can be bigger, right? So then they have leaves, and they can bring that nutrients down to the rest of the body as well. But they are seedless, so they do reproduce by spores, so very similar to our bryophyte friends. So ferns undergo their alteration of generations a little bit differently than our non-vascular friends, the bryophytes. So whereas the bryophytes had a dominant gametophyte generation, And the gametophyte, again, is the haploid stage, and the sporophyte, which is dominant in ferns, is the diploid stage. So they do have a dominant sporophyte, and if you notice the picture of the fern, the sporophyte are those fern fronds, right? That's what you would classically think of as a fern. And on the underside of those fronds are the spores. So if you look underneath, you can actually see those kind of brownish orange spores. So that is the diploid stage, and they do undergo a very tiny gametophyte generation for reproduction. But again, don't worry too much about that. Just know that it's a dominant sporophyte generation. So now our third group of plants are vascular, but now we are seeded. So now we have seeds instead of spores. And these guys are non-flowering. So we have two groups of these vascular seeded plants. One is non-flowering, which are gymnosperms, and one are flowering, which are angiosperms that we'll talk about next. So these guys are conifers, or cone-producing, usually tree-like or bush-like structures. So sequoias, redwoods, pines, firs, cedars, junipers. These guys are all conifers, okay, or gymnosperms. So they produce seeds and pollen. Okay, so the seeds and pollen can be coming from one plant, right? So if we look at the left, there's a branch there of maybe a pine tree, right, with a pine cone. And at the end you have the pollen. So that's the male part and the female part. So the cone contains the female gametes, and those pollen structures produce the male gametes. So essentially the pollen is able to fly through the wind, right, instead of through water. And it can pollinate another pine cone somewhere else, right? And so then once you have pollination, you get those developing seeds. So seeds are now very important. So you have the little seeds there on the bottom right, which is the developing embryo. Okay, which will then produce a new tree, a new sporophyte. Okay. So the gametophyte stage is in the cone. So the gametophyte is in the cone. So seeds are pretty important. They allow the embryo to grow fairly large, and it provides food for the embryo. And it also really protects that embryo. So it can go and move, right? The seeds can travel even further distances now instead of just spores, right? So these guys, and a lot of them have adaptations where they have little wing-like structures on them to even be carried by the wind even further. And again, we said pollen, which is the sperm gamete, it allows it to disperse in the wind, right? So, of course, we all are very familiar with pollen. Produces a lot of allergies during certain times of the year, but we don't need liquid water now to disperse the sperm cells like we did with our bryophytes, right? So that is a very good adaptation of these plants to have these protective seeds, as well as the pollen that can travel a long distance. Here are some different examples of our gymnosperms. So we have our conifers, just like our sequoias and the bristlecone pines, but we also have some more interesting ones like our juniper, ginkgo, if anyone takes ginkgo biloba, right? And our cycades. A lot of people have seen those. They look like kind of like palm trees a little bit, but they're more like bushes, and they have those cones in there as well. So now we have our last but probably biggest group of plants, and these are our vascular seeded flowering plants. So these guys are known as angiosperms. So they contain flowers, right? So flowers or fruit we'll talk about. So flowers are actually going to display that pollen. So it's going to actually help to disperse the pollen around even further distances. So we use pollinators, or they use pollinators, which are attracted to the flowers to disperse the pollen even further distances. So if you can think about how many pollinators are out there, right? I have an example here of a hummingbird, which is a pollinator. But bees are a very classic pollinator, right? So lots of pollinators out there that are going to be attracted to that flower, which is displaying that pollen, which will then be taken by the pollinator to another plant to become pollinated, right? Which will then produce a seed, okay? So then they also can contain fruit. Okay, so the flower is going to display the pollen, but the fruit actually surrounds the seed, right? So it's the protective layer around the seed, which attracts animals. Okay, and then animals can then disperse that seed to even further distances than maybe our gymnosperms, which, you know, the seeds may have little wings on them to be dispersed by the wind. But now if we have animals to help disperse the seeds, that is even more advantageous for these plants. So you can kind of think of what other methods can seeds disperse by, right? So we have animals that can disperse them, wind that can disperse them, water, right? So lots of methods for seed dispersion. So this is really our most successful group of plants, and they are really adapted to many different environments, right? So in a lot of plants that you think of that maybe don't have flowers, or you think they don't have flowers, actually do. So all grasses essentially have flowers. They're all flowering plants, right? Cactus has flowers, right? So lots of different plants, flowering plants out there. And there's really a lot of different biomes that have plant adaptations. So we'll talk about our different biomes of the world, but essentially you're thinking, you know, desert biome, forest biome, right? That's what a biome is a different environment that these plants have adapted to very well. So just to finish up with the angiosperm life cycle, just showing the male gametophyte in the pollen, and then you have the female gametophyte in the ovary, which is kind of deeper within that flower, right? So in that internal structure. So the pollen is going to be taken probably by a pollinator to another plant, so you can have this cross-pollination, right, which will then produce a seed, which is the diploid sporophyte, which will then turn into a new plant. So welcome to the world of plants. I think they're pretty awesome. So I will see you guys next time and to talk about animals. Thanks a lot.